What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Know Your Enemy. My name is TrendKiLL. Let's go! So in Know Your Enemy, if you haven't watched this series before, we take an in-depth look at a specific god. We talk about the god's weaknesses, the god's strengths, and we tell you some tips on how to play against that god should you find that god in your game. Without wasting too much time in the intro, let's go ahead and get into it. Today we're going to be talking about Ah Muzen Cab, the Mayan god of... It's still bees? It's still bees. The Mayan god of bees. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is take a look at Ah Muzen Cab's graph. Now for the remainder of the video, I'm going to be calling him AMC because 1, it's his nickname, and 2, it's much easier to say. So moving forward, we can look at the fact that just like most of the hunters in the game, AMC is very one-sided. He is damage, damage, damage. His mobility and control are tied at only halfway up the graph for his second highest stat. His utility, defense, and healing are fairly low, and we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about his abilities. He at least has some sort of healing, but his ability to heal is very limited. Now, depending on the skill of the AMC player, the utility and control could be higher on this graph if they utilize his abilities correctly. But if we leave this graph up to the skill of the player you're going to be playing, it's going to be completely different every time. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and move into his ability so we can see why his graph is shaped the way that it is. Alright, so first off, let's talk about his passive bees. This is very interesting to me because from a design standpoint, I greatly prefer when a character's passive is the center of their kit. I don't know why, it's just a preference that I have, but a lot like Neith and her broken weaves, AMC has his bees. So essentially, as AMC is using his abilities, bees come to his aid and provide an almost seemingly permanent dot on the enemy. So 3 of AMC's 4 abilities have the potential to apply the dot damage from bees. In addition to that, AMC's auto attacks also refresh the duration of that dot. Now that dot only lasts for 2 seconds initially, but if he auto attacks enough or uses abilities enough to apply bees for 4 seconds or more, then that target is disarmed for 1 second. Now I can't remember if we have or have not talked about the debuff disarm yet, but in case we haven't, disarm debuffs you so that you cannot auto attack. Now when we get into his next ability, Hive, we'll talk about the fact that AMC is not a hunter that you want to box as another hunter. If I had to pick one thing that AMC does and does very well, it is outbox an opponent. And last but definitely not least, his damage per tick on that dot is 8 plus 5% of your physical power per tick, and those tick every half second for however long you have bees applied. So if you hit that 4-second mark and you just happen to stop, the dot from bees is going to tick a total of 8 times. Now let's say you have around 200 physical power, which for simple math, and because it's very easy to hit, your bees are going to do about 140, 150 damage over that 8 seconds. And they're going to disarm the target for 1 second. So all things considered, if both of you are even, a free 150 damage plus a 1 second disarm just from passive abilities should be enough to make you think, he's already kind of got the scales tipped in his favor. Now add on top of that, that while you are affected by bees, you are revealed on the minimap. So if you're having a boxing match in the jungle, everybody's gonna know where you're at. So if you realize you're getting outboxed by him and you decide to run away, for 2 seconds after he hits you with the last auto attack, you're revealed on the minimap, which gives AMC's jungler the potential to chase you down, or anybody else for that matter. And on top of all of that, if somebody is affected by the debuff bees and walks next to somebody else who is not affected by bees, bees will spread to that opponent. So if AMC happens to be boxing you and you run away and you've got somebody that is close to death that's on your team and you run near to them, bees are going to spread to that person and could possibly kill them if they're very close to dying. So with all that being said, we know that already he's not somebody that you necessarily want to box because he's already got a few things that give him the upper hand. Let's talk about his first ability, Hive. Essentially, Hive is a ground-targeted ability that allows AMC to create a hive that gives an AoE effect around it. Now, because he's the god of bees, this hive only affects AMC, but it affects him in a very, very specific way. If AMC is within the radius of his Hive, which is a very large radius, mind you, he gets a 50% attack speed bonus, a 30% movement speed bonus, and a 12 health per second bonus, or 60 HP 5 bonus. Now understand that's at max rank, but still, at max rank, when he has 5 ranks in Hive, he gets an innate 50% attack speed bonus, 30% movement speed bonus, and he heals 12 health per second. Now that is an innate bonus just for being by his Hives. So remember, that's on top of all of the items that he's purchased. So while AMC is around his Hives, he is faster than you, will attack faster than you, will have a very slow heal over time, a very slow damage over time, and a disarm, and all the while, even if you try to run, you are revealed to the enemies on the minimap. My god. Now, in addition to that, he can have 6 Hives out at one time. If he were to place a 7th Hive, the first Hive that he placed will be destroyed. And on top of that, if he has 2 Hives next to each other, the effects from 2 Hives will not stack. All right, let's talk about his next ability, Swarm. This is a fairly wide line type ability, and other than the fact that this applies the bees debuff to the enemies that it hits, it's just a basic line damaging ability. Not much to be said about Swarm. However, do remember that this ability reapplies bees. And remember that if you have bees applied to you for 4 seconds, you get that disarm. So even if he misses 3 auto attacks on you, if he happens to smack you with Swarm when it comes off cooldown, that bees will be reapplied. Now let's talk about his third ability called Honey. This is an interesting ability in the sense that it was the first ability in the game and is still one of the very few abilities that allows you to paint the ground instead of having a predetermined shape of an attack. So as you are using Honey, you can kind of control which pattern you want the honey to go on the ground in. So this makes Honey a very versatile ability. Now, if you hit somebody with Honey and you do not have a Hive around, Honey is just going to slow the target by 25% while they're in it. However, if a Hive happens to be in the area, they will also take a dot damage while they're in it and have bees applied to them as they exit the honey. Now, in addition to having Hive on the ground, AMC can also quote-unquote activate Honey by casting Swarm over a section of it. His last ability and his ultimate, Stinger, this is a straight shot line-based ability that hits one god and then sticks to that god. Now once it sticks, it applies bees, cripples them for 3 seconds, and after that 3 seconds, the Stinger drops to the ground, allowing AMC to pick it back up. If he should be able to get to it and pick it back up, it reduces the cooldown of his ultimate by 80%. Now when you've got an ability that does 595 base damage, 110% of your physical power, and applies bees, and cripples you for 3 seconds, and you've got that all on a 15-second cooldown if you're good enough at hitting his ultimate, AMC can be a pretty devastating hunter. So let's go ahead and move into the mechanics section and talk a little bit about some tips on how to play against him so that you can avoid getting destroyed. Alright, so in the mechanics section, let's talk about some tips on how to play or play against an AMC. First off, let's talk about the fact that he does not have a dash or a jump. So very early on, actually pretty much for the whole game, he can be really easy to gank. Anytime a god has low mobility, they become a target for the enemy team's assassin. So let's couple that with another tip in the fact that if Ah Muzen Cab gets ahead early, he is very dangerous for the rest of the game. You don't want to ever box an Ah Muzen Cab, especially if you are behind him. Anytime it's not a good idea to box a god even if you are equal to him, it's never a good time to box them if you're behind. So if you couple his low mobility and the fact that if he gets ahead early he can be dangerous, this is a god that you want to gank early and often. 1, he's a very easy target, and 2, that keeps him from getting too far ahead to where he becomes an issue for your hunter. Now, if he is not ganked early and often, understand that he has very strong clearing abilities. His second ability, Swarm, can take out a wave on its own. He's also got the potential to use Honey and auto attacks to take out the wave. So a lot of the times if you're fighting an AMC, especially if he's ahead, you can go ahead and assume that you may be in your tower because he's got the ability to not only clear your wave, but also annoy you and poke you with these constant barrage of dots that over a span of several minutes becomes dangerous. Now again, if you do get hit with one of those dots and it applies the bees, don't spread the bees to your team, especially don't spread the bees to your minions. Your minions have far less HP than your Guardian does. Spreading something like 50 damage to your Guardian's not the end of the world. You spread that to your wave, and all of a sudden your minion wave is half as strong as it used to be. So if you do that, all you're doing is putting yourself further behind him because you're making it easier for him to clear your wave. Now, before we get into talking about his abilities, let's talk about one more general tip. AMC shoots his auto attacks out of his left hand. I believe he's the only god in the game that shoots auto attacks out of their left hand, and instead of having a bow and arrow and bringing that bow to center to meet your left hand so that you can pull and shoot arrows, AMC just shoots his auto attacks out of his left hand. So while that might not give him a massive benefit physically or mechanically, it does give him a little bit of mind game to the fact that you're not used to seeing auto attacks coming from that direction. Now, it can play a little bit into how the auto attack hits the hitbox of the enemies, but it's not going to be generally enough for a beginner's guide to have to worry about. Just understand that this can be a little confusing coming from somebody who may have played against Neith and Rom and Cupid. You're used to seeing them shoot that bow from center mass, and then you've got this guy who's shooting auto attacks from the left-hand side of his body. It's just a little odd to visualize that. Now let's talk very quickly about his passive because I highly doubt this is ever going to happen. But remember, if bees stay on someone for 4 seconds, they become disarmed. If bees happen to stay on someone for 8 seconds, they become disarmed again. Now, you don't realize how long 8 seconds is in a SMITE match, especially if you're boxing someone one-on-one, so it's very rare that you're even gonna last 8 seconds. Maybe if you're playing against Hercules or somebody like that, who is gonna have his heal slowly healing him while you're attacking him. But yes, you can be disarmed twice in the same span of bees, and I would assume, because of that you could also be disarmed 3 and 4 and 5 times if a fight ever happens to go 20 seconds with AMC continually pelting you. Alright, let's talk quickly about his hives. Remember that you can destroy his hives, but they can only be destroyed by auto attacks. You cannot use abilities to destroy hive. So anything that counts as an auto attack, like obviously your auto attacks, Freya's pulse, Athena's reach where she throws her spear, those all count as auto attacks and can all destroy hives. Also, his hives, I mentioned this before, but they do not overlap. So AMC cannot put 2 hives next to each other and stand in the overlapping Venn diagram area and get double the bonus. If he has the bonus already, that is the max bonus that he will get. Now, his second ability, Swarm, again, very simple, not a lot of tips here, but his second ability, Swarm, remember, activates honey. So AMC doesn't have to have a hive down to activate his honey with bees. So just because you've killed his last hive that's in the area, that does not mean that he can't activate his honey with Swarm. Another thing about Swarm is that Swarm can be cast through walls. So if you happen to be running around a corner, you're not necessarily safe because he can just cast it through the wall and hope that it catches up to you and hits you. Now, I know we've already covered a lot of tips in a very short amount of time, but there's a lot to talk about with AMC, and most of the things to talk about are very simple to explain. They're just reminders that I want to make sure you keep in mind as you're playing against him. So let's talk about honey for a second. And unfortunately, this might be one of the more confusing abilities in the game. First off, it doesn't tell you how long honey lasts. Honey lasts for about 4 seconds on the ground, so you're slow if they happen to stay in that slow. That slow happens for 4 seconds. Also, another interesting thing that is explained well in the tooltip, but mechanically doesn't make much sense, when they're standing in honey, they take the dot damage from honey. They do not, however, take the dot damage from bees. The passive bees is not applied until they exit honey, meaning that they could be standing in bees, yet not have the bees passive applied to them. Bees as an effect, a visual effect in the game, does not actually mean bees the passive. And I know that's really weird and very confusing to understand, and mechanically doesn't make any sense because they're getting bees on them while they're in the honey. Why do they not have the passive bees on them until they exit the honey? I don't know. So that is a bit odd. And lastly, about honey, and not that you would ever have time to check this, but the tooltip that pops up on the debuff of honey is incorrect. The debuff of honey says that you are slowed and that Ah Muzen Cab will do more damage to you. That is not the case. I've tested all of his abilities and his auto attacks, and none of them do more damage while honey is applied to you. So not that you've ever read the honey debuff tooltip, but just in case you have, understand that that is incorrect. And last but not least, his ultimate, Stinger, remember that after this hits you, it lasts on you for 3 seconds and then drops to the ground. Or, if you die within that 3 seconds, it drops to the ground when you die. So AMC can pick that back up for a massive reduced cooldown. Now, one tip I can give you is that if you get hit by his stinger, instead of fighting him, if you think that you might lose that fight, one thing you can do is try to get away from him, maybe back to safety, like in a tower or something like that. If you're close to a place where AMC can't go without risk of death, try to bait that stinger into the tower or into safety so that he's got to put himself at risk to get that reduced cooldown. And last but not least, let's talk about one thing that I think is slightly overlooked as we talk about all of the cool things that he can do. He relies heavily on his Hive. If he doesn't have his Hive, he's actually worse than most of the hunters in the game. Around his Hive, he is very, very strong. But the fact that he has no mobility puts him vastly behind anybody who does, especially if the person who does have a mobility move also has some sort of CC. So again, this goes for every single god that has low mobility. If you are not careful with your positioning, you are going to die. If you are a god that has no mobility, you need to rely on your CC. If you are a god that has no mobility and no CC, you are what's called a target. So for those of you who are playing AMC and are trying to watch this guide to get an idea on what you should be doing, remember that positioning with AMC is absolutely paramount to your success. If you are remotely overextended, you are probably going to get killed. All right, so there you have it. Now, normally in the outro, I'd throw a few puns in, and usually I just wing it, but I refuse to put puns in this episode just to create buzz. It would be too easy. And if you don't believe me, you can go back and check the spelling of all the tips. I assure you that the spelling is 100% accurate. Anyway, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. Thanks for stopping by and hanging out with me. Hopefully you enjoyed yourself. Hopefully you learned a little bit about Ah Muzen Cab, and hopefully you come back and check us out next week when we're gonna be talking about the Egyptian god of Earth, Geb. You know, like rocky Earth, not the whole Earth. You know what I mean. If you're watching the Know Your Enemy series, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you are a new player. If that assumption is correct, there's a very good chance you do not own Nuwa. So go ahead and click the subscribe button now to get access to Nuwa and the Water Dancer skin for free.